So it's my great delight now to chair the next section of this symposium. I'm Elaine Bobby. I want to take the opportunity for a moment to thank Marshall for a very kind introduction. We have indeed been colleagues for a very long time, and the university has indeed transformed in the last 30 years. So, in the second section, you'll have seen that Ros Ballister was to speak first in the second section. Ros is currently in hospital, and I've just been told she's joined us online. So thank you, Ros. But I'm very going to be going on a walk in Antwerp with Ros. I've seen the slides, they're wonderful, but we're not going for a walk in Antwerp with Ros. But we do have 3 other talks, the first of which is about Ben's fiction, Arunico, which Helen and I pronounce differently. Helen's fiction, Arunico, which is about a slave uprising.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. And thank you, everybody, for responding to my original suggestion that we should get together at this age in our work. I think we've already learned how helpful it's going to be. I'm sorry I'm the first speaker not to be talking about sex. Apologies for disappointing you on that. But in the week of Windrush Day and the government's premature closing of the Windrush unit, I think it's very, very important that we think about an aspect of Ben's work. And it's an aspect of her work, Orinoco, or Orinoco. I'm only talking about one feature of it, but obviously probably the best known feature. There are many other things that I'm working on in the edition, but it seems to me that as an editor in our current environment, it's very important to consider this aspect of the work. Now, what is Orinoco? That's one of the questions that I'm trying to answer in my head note. We've already heard about fiction, history, novel, memoir, travel narrative, polemic. There's all sorts of possible labels for this work, coming quite late in Ben's fiction career. Is it fiction? Is it partly truth? This is one of the things that we're all grappling with, and one of the things that fascinates about this text. But I would suggest that if we look at it through the lens of the attitude to slavery, then it's pretty clear how central this is to the work. You think about the 2 settings. One is the setting for the source of enslaved peoples, that is West Africa, and the other is one of the communities in the Americas, Suriname, which was a slave colony. So just describing the text, you come across this as a fundamental sort of feature, kind of ribbon through the whole work, the source of slavery and the site of slavery. And I think as an editor, and if I were clever with PowerPoint, I would have done this in circles, concentric circles. I think starting at the center, there's the life, obviously, and the ideas and the outlook and the work of Ben herself in the middle. Around that is her own historical moment. And then thirdly, very importantly, our context. We are working for readers now. We're not living in 1688. What are our attitudes, and how are those going to affect how we consider this work? So I have questions relating to those 3 things: the author herself, the historical moment, and our context in relation to attitudes to slavery. First of all, I guess we must confront the question, was Ben an eyewitness to this, as she claims? The royal slave I had the honor to know in my travels to the other worlds. Though I had none above me in that country, yet I wanted power to preserve this great man, her hero, Orinoco, the royal slave. If there be anything that seemed romantic, I beseech your lordship to consider these countries do in all things so far differ from ours, that they produce unconceivable wonders. At least they appear so to us because new and strange. So this relationship between the writer, the dedicatee, in this case, the reader, and the attitude to otherness, to going somewhere else. This is a claim made in the dedicatory epistle. Obviously, it's also made by the narrator, who's not necessarily the same as Ben, but here it's in the epistle. And she's claiming knowledge, she's claiming a kind of personal involvement, eyewitness to the sufferings of enslaved peoples. I have my own experience of going to Suriname to draw on, and I obviously it's a tightrope we have to walk about whether or not we sense that this is actually her experience. I do tend towards the thinking that she was there, but that's an aspect, one aspect of relating to this work and to editing it. The second is it's about the author, but it's also about the era. And the difficulty, and we've been talking about this and how readers now respond to this, the difficulty of separating the individual, the author, the creator, from the ideas of the period towards, in this case, the beauty of an African man. And it's uncomfortable reading for many of us. He had an extreme good and graceful mien and all the civility of a well-bred great man. He had nothing of barbarity in his nature, so it's already being set against others of his own background, which is the implication here. The most famous statuary could not form the figure of a man more admirably turned from head to foot. And now the contrasts become very outspoken. His face was not of that brown, rusty black which most of that nation are, but of perfect ebony or polished jet. Is this a real person, or is this a jewel? Is this a statue? Polished jet. And his nose was rising and Roman instead of African and flat. His mouth, the finest shape that could be seen, far from those great turned lips which are so natural to the rest of the Negroes. Very distressing for modern readers. How do we as readers, as editors, deal with this? There was no one grace wanting that bears the standard of true beauty. So she's bringing together the exotic and the European and saying it's the best of everything. But that, of course, is a very unfortunate position to take vis-a-vis African beauty. But I have to say, I think that Ben, she's so ambivalently placed in this text. She, or the narrator, we might say, is actually quite enlightened for her day, and we have to set her in her historical context. Here is an image from one of the maps of Suriname showing the native Indians of that area, so the indigenous South African people. Showing, I mean, this is an echo of Othello. There's somebody whose heads grow beneath their shoulders. There's somebody without a head, with the face in the body, in the chest on the left. Now, if you think that that is the kind of currency that Ben is dealing with, then you realize that actually she's a lot more sympathetic than that previous passage might suggest. In fact, when I was speaking to people, local people in Suriname, they hailed Ben as a revolutionary for being the first text that they had encountered that gave equal presence to the African, the native indigenous peoples of South America and the white European perspective. They were really admirers of Ben, and these are contemporary Suriname people. So I want to say that we have to set our discomfort with a lot of the text, potential racism of the text, alongside its historical era and relativize it to that extent, I feel. There's also, very interestingly, a sense that there are double attitudes to slavery itself, because of course there is a notion of slavery which is honorable. Why, said Orinoco in his great tirade against slavery, my dear friends and fellow sufferers, should we be slaves to an unknown people? Have they vanquished us nobly in fight? Have they won us in honorable battle? Are we by the chance of war become their slaves? Quite acceptable. In fact, it happens in the court of which Orinoco is a part, that in war, it's honorable to be given in slavery if you've lost, if you've been captured. But no, he's saying we are bought and sold like apes or monkeys. to be the sport of women, fools and cowards. I'm not going to talk about the gendering issue there and putting in the women along with the fools and cowards. That's another talk. But here, it seems to me, there is, again, we mustn't simplify our sense, our anger, our sense of guilt about the past and the practice of slavery. We have to understand the era out of which this text comes. There's, moving into our own era though, it's very, I think, comforting to many readers that there is an outspokenness, a polemical aspect to this fiction or this history, which actually highlights the horror of slavery and the fact that it is the white Europeans, in fact, the place from which Behn herself is writing, who are to be criticized. This is when Orinoco is seized, and he's being unarmed and defenseless, so it was in vain to make any resistance. He only beheld the captain, who is the British English captain of the ship, with a look all fierce and disdainful, upbraiding him with eyes that forced blushes on his guilty cheeks. He only cried in passing over the side of the ship, "Farewell, sir, 'tis worth my suffering to gain so true a knowledge both of you and of your gods, by whom you swear." So this is a text which dissociates itself from the very readership towards whom it is aimed, those who swear by Christian gods, those who are comfortable in their lives and might have sugar in their whatever drink they're having because of the practice of slavery. So this is a text about gaining true knowledge. And as an editor, I think I'm juggling all the time these three things: Behn's own attitude and experience, the moment of history and the complexity of that moment out of which it comes. And I'm not talking about the political moment at this point, I'm talking about the cultural moment to do with slavery, but also our current sensibilities. How can I, as an editor, help readers to engage with this text, not to be made violently angry by it, but also made to have a sense of both the opportunities that the text gives for engagement with and sympathy with the enslaved peoples, but also the challenge to our sensibilities that it offers. I think, although it's uncomfortable, there's never been a better time to re-edit Orinoco because of our awareness of the whole issue and the heritage and the tainted quality of everything that we have gained through the history of slavery in the European nations. I recently went to a magnificent exhibition at the Royal Academy in London, which is now finished, I'm sorry to say. It was entitled, and you'll get the reference, I'm sure, "From Souls Grown Deep Like the Rivers." It's an exhibition of Afro-American art from the South. And this is Richard Dial's 1988 sculpture. And the interesting thing is that African Americans from the South had no training, were not in academies, had no materials, so they used everything that they could lay their hands on, bits of wooden sheds, bits of metal. And out of this, Richard Dial made "Which Prayer Ended Slavery?" That's the title of this sculpture. And you can see someone being whipped, you can see someone enchained, you can see someone hanging. And at the top, is that somebody kneeling? Is that somebody praying, or are they kneeling as below because they're being whipped? It's a very, I think, a very poignant and expressive piece of art. How can our making Orinoco available again in our edition contribute to a sense of this kind of engagement with the past? And when I use the word responsibility in my title, I mean, in a way, the responsibility of an editor. We are responsible to the author and her text and her moment, but we're also responsible to readers now. And that's my dilemma, but that's my opportunity as well. Thank you.
No slide, is that correct?
Sorry.
It's quite all right.
Very boring.
Thank you, Heather. Our next speaker in this section is Gevirtz, who is talking about bigamy and murder.
And I don't have any slides because I figure the subject is far too sensational to need any embellishment. Not to mention, I'm afraid of what I might have to offer. So I just would like to express my thanks to Elaine and to the general editors for the very great privilege of being included in this really vital and very thrilling edition, and also to thank the IAS very much for the fellowship that made it possible for me to be here. So thank you. So the history of the nun was printed in 1689, in the middle of the revolution that dethroned James II and enthroned Mary II and William III. So it was a rather exciting time. The story of the history of the nun goes like this. Isabella Valerie is put into a convent as a toddler. After the death of her mother, her father becomes a Jesuit. He orders that at age 13, she must choose between marriage, which he calls the world, or becoming a nun. Of course, she grows into a paragon of beauty, accomplishment, and virtue. And upon being introduced into society at age 13, she attracts scads of eligible young men. The most, and if you're going, ew, yes, you should. Okay, she's 13. The most notable of these eligible young men is Villenois, a nobleman on his way to join the French forces at the siege of Candia on Crete, which was a real engagement. Isabella rejects his suit and becomes a nun. A few years later, however, she falls in love with her best friend's brother-in-law, who comes frequently to visit his sister. After much languishing, sighing, blushing, whatevering, they elope. They are forgiven by the church. Remember, she is a nun, but disowned by Eno's father. So Eno takes up farming to support his wife, and he proves quite bad at it. He decides instead to make his fortune in the army, which is a good profession for a nobleman. And like Villenois before him, goes to join the French forces at the siege of Candia on Crete. Eno actually seeks out Villenois. They talk about Isabella, and as the narrator puts it, from that moment became like two sworn brothers until Eno is killed in action. Villenois returns. He woos Isabella. After a few years of decorous widowhood, she agrees to marry him. Isabella loves her second husband, who is besotted, thoughtful, and spectacularly rich. Her love for Eno fades away. Then, one evening, when Villenois is out of town, Eno turns up. It turns out, no, it's not dead. So Isabella does what anyone would do in that situation. She smothers him with a pillow. And then, lo and behold, Villenois also turns up unexpectedly that night. Isabella tells him that Eno has returned and has died peacefully in the bed of grief when he hears that she has remarried. And together she and Villenois decide to hide Eno's return. Villenois stuffs Eno's body into a sack prior to throwing it into the river. But Isabella, now fearing that she has lost Villenois's love, because it turned out that she was married to a living Eno all the time that they were married, sews her current husband's coat to the sack containing the first husband, and Villenois not only throws the body into the river, but also throws himself into the river with the body. Both bodies are recovered, but at first only Villenois is recognized. Isabella proceeds to have appropriate hysterics. Then someone recognizes Eno's body. So the authorities confront Isabella. She confesses everything and she is publicly beheaded. The end. Now, as you might imagine, there's quite a lot to say about this narrative, but I want to talk about only one exciting point, which is why she murders Eno to begin with when he inconveniently returns from the dead. One would think there are perhaps other solutions. And at this point, I feel incumbent to say morally, murder is not the solution. However, Behn's readers would have recognized the depth of Isabella's crisis, because in England, as of 1604, bigamy was a felony and therefore a capital crime. In 17th century Europe, however, people disappeared all the time for all sorts of reasons, and their spouses never knew what had happened to them. The law thus defined bigamy as the acquisition of a new spouse while knowing that your current spouse was alive. The law also permitted the bereft spouse to remarry after waiting a minimum of 7 years, under the theory that if they haven't turned up after 7 years, they're probably not going to. Sometimes, however, people were located or popped up again, a la Martin Guerre. In cases where the missing spouse turned up, the law declared no felony had been committed, just an honest mistake. In the States, we would say no harm, no foul. As for which marriage remained intact, however, the return of the original spouse invalidated the second marriage, and the remarried spouse had to return to their first legal partner. You can see where this is going and why Isabella might be distraught. Whether she had waited 7 years or not, and she didn't, only bad things can happen to her now. Hinault's return would cause a scandal, and all her life, whether as a nun, a widow, or a wife, Isabella has worked hard to appear to be a model of virtue, with some exceptional moments. Furthermore, Isabella has a peaceful, luxurious, highly satisfying life. But once everyone knows that Hinault is back, she will have to give up that wonderful life and return to him. Remember that this is the man who could not make anything good happen. His cattle died, his crops failed, his barns burned down, and his horses, quote, would fight and kill one another. Before he joined the army, the narrator reports, it became a proverb all over the country. If any ill luck happened to anybody, they would say they had Hinault's luck, unquote. Not to mention, Hinault can be quite selfish and self-centered. It never occurs to him that, or had occurred to him when he was a slave, that Isabella might change in her affection or situation. He assumes that she still loves him and still wants to be married to him. When he sees how richly she lives when he returns, he does not rejoice at her comfort. Oh, good, she's okay. But he fears that she, quote, had lost her virtue, whatever that means. From Isabella's point of view, if Hinault would just go away again, before anyone knows he's returned, she can stay with Villenois and be happy. So is there a better solution than murder? Well, the first thing she thinks of actually is suicide. Unsurprisingly, she decides that if someone has to die, maybe it shouldn't be her. Who should it be? Why? Hinault, of course. This wouldn't seem to us to be a great situation or solution either, but well, let's think about it for a moment. What can she do? She misses the opportunity to refuse to recognize him, call him an imposter, and drive him off. That's one opportunity wasted. And let's face it, he's impossible to bribe. He has survived 7 years of brutal slavery by thinking about returning to her. He's not going to give that up for money, not now. So maybe there isn't a better solution than murder. Sounds unnerving, but Isabella's decision to murder Hinault looks very different to a reader who understands the legal context than it does to one who doesn't. Behn doesn't have to tell her audience of 1689 that Isabella's desperation comes from a law that doesn't acknowledge that people as well as situations change, and sometimes for the better. Isabella looks a lot more unstable, a lot more emotional, a lot crazier to an audience that doesn't know any of this. And so as an editor, although it's my responsibility to avoid providing an interpretation, it's also true that in some cases, as in this issue, it's quite unavoidable to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was wonderful as well. The final talk in this session is going to be from Maureen Bell, who's going to talk to us about one of the other contexts of famous fiction, with, say, who gives themselves these books.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you for inviting me. I don't have a text to talk about. My job is to say occasionally, do you know anything about who published this? Do you know anything about who printed it? And to make helpful, I hope, suggestions occasionally. Anyway, my task just now is to talk about a little bit about makers and sellers of Behn's books, and to enthuse you for the detective work that this sort of thing involves. So you'll all want to do it, and you'll all get as far as you can. Okay. I'm going to start by showing you just a few title pages. This is one I've not seen before, but somebody, what does it mean? Somebody had it anyway in the, yes, it was. Thanks for introducing me to this one. How do you find out about the people who printed and published Behn's books? Well, you could look at the imprint, but you know, in this case, it's not a Behn edition, but Will o' the Wisp at the sign of the moon in the ecliptic doesn't get me very far. So this is the health warning. Don't believe everything you read in imprints. I should say I will loosely use the word publisher for the person who financed and, you know, organized the distribution of the text. But in the 17th century, there was no such job. You weren't a publisher, you were a printer or a bookseller who did those things. If we look at one or two more imprints, I can just explain that. Here's the Patient Fancy, a Behn imprint, printed by Elizabeth Fletcher for Richard Thompson and Jacob Thompson. I had to get a woman in there somewhere, and that was the only one I'd got to work with. You can see here that we've got, usefully, the person who printed it, Elizabeth Fletcher, who she printed it for, and the Thompsons, therefore, are, you usually take the for to mean the people following the for are the people who put it up, organized it, financed it, and so on. And usefully, it gives you their addresses as well. So that's quite a useful sort of imprint. Here's another one, The Fair Jilt. You've seen this one before. You've got the printer and you've got somebody who purports to be the publisher, and again, an address. Canning, you'll have seen several times if you notice imprints this morning, because Canning was the person who sold and possibly published, in the sense of organizing, most of Behn's early fictional works. So he crops up a lot. Here we've got another one, Love Letters. This was Alex's that we started with, printed and are to be sold by, which isn't so helpful really. But Randall Taylor is a particular favourite of mine because he was so bad. He was the stationer's company Beadle, and quite how he kept the position for so long, I do not know, because the court books are full of him, drunk, swearing at the master, and there was an incident on the barge that I've never quite got to the bottom of. But he was a trade publisher. I mean, his name appears on many, many, many imprints, but he didn't actually organize the publishing himself. He sold them near, as you can see, Station Salt. Anyway, he's a favorite. This is the third part of Love Letters, and here, an even less useful imprint, printed and are to be sold by most booksellers. Very helpful, isn't it? Anyway, if there were an ideal imprint, it would be this. Printed by so-and-so, for so-and-so, and to be sold by so-and-so. Extraordinarily rare. I mean, you really don't find the full whack very often. So you're left with trying to find out about the names you've got. Now, I've got a slide that has some numbers on it. I would like you to forget the numbers, that I wouldn't go to the stake for any of them. It's kind of the back of a fag packet kind of thing, except I don't smoke anymore. If you look at Behn's books published in her lifetime, and I'm saying this is a bit of a, well, possibly these numbers aren't quite right, but they're not very far out. It depends which attributions you accept, and it depends whether we've decided to include them
in the volumes, and I did the list that I made this from so long ago that I've no idea anymore. But roughly speaking, there are about 50 printers and booksellers in the imprints of her lifetime texts. About 18 of them have the printed by. 4, pointing towards the economic backer and the publisher, about 28 booksellers and bookseller publishers, and the sold by only about 7. So you'd think it's an odd sort of pattern, but in fact, usefully, Don Mackenzie did a count for 1688, which is when most of these things came out, of the amount of anonymous printing there was, that is to say, imprints with no printer named, and it's about 60%, which is what is the case here. About 60% of the texts didn't have printers' names, and the same is true of Behn. So she's not being treated oddly or differently because she's her or because she's a woman. It's just what it's like, and that's, you know, that's how it is. After her death, about another 20 names you can add, of which only 6 or 7 had worked on texts of hers during her lifetime. So immediately forget that and move to why bother, really. Put more politely, there are all sorts of things we can find out just from knowing the names, which is enormously, I think, useful and fun to do. Circumstances of publication. Is there a frequent association between Behn's text and this particular publisher, the Thompsons, for instance, Knight and Saunders, or is this stationer a one-off? And there are a lot of those. But again, I'm not sure that's all that unusual. Is this a stationer who's a very established, experienced, long-running firm? Thompson's are the obvious ones there, or Canning, who you've seen several times related to these fictions, is a really interesting one, and the one that both Marianne O'Donnell and I have had problems finding out about. But I think either I'm down a rabbit hole or I've found something, or both. The thing is that Canning is a newly freed, he's only just come out of his apprenticeship person, setting up at the beginning. And these are the beginnings of the books the texts we now call fictions. And as well as that, there are things about where he lives, but I'll mention that later. How does this particular text fit into the stationer's own list of publications? You know, forget Behn for a minute. What's this person doing more generally? And is there a reason why this stationer's publications list, shall we say, would include Behn, or would want to include Behn at this point in this time, which takes you into, of course, the historical context that people have talked about already. You need to know what was happening in that year in 1687, 88, which is a really, really good place to be if you want to, you know, explore the history. Does the address suggest clues to the likely market for this text? And I'll show you a slide in a minute that answers that. And was, more broadly, is there any reason to suspect that the stationer is in sympathy with Behn's particular positions on a variety of things, from, you know, religion, politics, topical things that are going on at the minute? Here's a not very good reproduction of the Agas map, which is far too early, but I picked it up simply because I wanted to show you where Canning was. William Canning, the newly set up in his own shop stationer, is in the Inns of Court, and on the right-hand side in purple you can see the old St. Paul's. On the left-hand side you can see Whitehall and Westminster, and the red bits are buildings associated with the Inns of Court. And where Canning was in the bottom, almost rectangular, next to the river bit, which is Temple. And if I take you to the next one, that's a close-up of, you can see the top of Fleet Street, Middle Temple Passage on the very left-hand, bottom left-hand corner, which goes down to the river. If you were going to the Temple, that's where you would arrive, and you would walk up that street. And the two addresses that Canning uses are Vineport, which is, you can just about make out on the left, or Temple Cloisters, which is across the road. I'm beginning to think these are the same building, that it's the same address, because Vinecourt burnt down twice in the late 1670s, and there were arguments about whether it should be rebuilt or whether it's too bad to rebuild. So I really don't know at the minute. But knowing that, and knowing that Canning was, as I say, newly let out into the world as a master stationer, and looking at those fictions and at what else Canning was publishing. He's got a very short publication history, really, you know, only a couple of years worth. One of the things he published at the same time as he was publishing Ben, for instance, is dedicated to the comptroller of, I can't remember if it's the Inner Temple or the Middle Temple. He's doing a pitch for being part of this world, which is lawyers, baby lawyers, people who are interested in, people who have certain tastes. And that's precisely where he is, where whether you were coming from the Fleet Street end to Temple or you were coming up from the river, that's exactly where he is. Anyway, these are the sorts of things you can find out. I'm still not sure absolutely about Canning. I need to do some more digging, but only last week found somebody who knew the name Canning because she was investigating his wife. Yes, didn't know he had one. Well, widow actually, but interestingly, she, like him, seems to relate to the archives in the temple. When she's poor and she wants some money, that's where she goes. She doesn't go to the stationer's hall. She doesn't go, stationers do charity for widows. She doesn't go there. So there are interesting things about this orientation of his that take you to a very particular market for a particular kind of text that I think is really important. But anyway, if anybody were wanting to do any of this kind of stuff for themselves, these are the sorts of places to look. But there's also serendipity, i.e. meeting the person who knows Canning's wife. You know, I could not have imagined a better time at which to find out this bit of information. For everybody's information, and just to embarrass her, while Leah's here, if you want to read the absolutely very, very cogent argument for why you have to take the book trade very seriously when looking at fiction, although Leah's book, Novel Ventures, starts in 1690, really, covers a period really mostly 18th century. What she has to say about the way in which the trade and its practices and persons shaped a new genre is really, really important. If you want to know a bit about the argument for why we should take this seriously in relation to Ben, there's a couple of short bits. Kate Osmonds is using Ben as a case study for arguing for a wider thing, which is feminist bibliography, and then, you know, shameless promotion, an argument that had been simmering for a very long time before I ever got it into print, like from the 90s. It's an argument with Germaine Greer, which, you know, is all about how if you just assume that the things that happen to Ben in relation to publishers is because she's a woman, you're wrong, because you need to know the context of how the book trade works and then be able to judge how savvy she was in knowing how it worked and exploiting it to her advantage. So that's about it, really. Thank you.